Hello there. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built these rustic woodsheds. We're going to start with a couple sticks. For this project, I used 1/4-inch sticks for the main structure, and then 1/8-inch sticks for everything else. At this point, if they're a little too curvy, you can bend them into shape. The sticks I'm using in this video have been drying out for about 2 weeks. They aren't fully dried out at this point, but they will be before I start gluing everything together. After doing a test woodshed, I realized that I should probably take the bark off of these, because anytime you see timbers used in construction, the bark is almost always removed. I chose to use a box cutter for this, and yeah, I realized it's been quite a while since I whittled a stick. I probably haven't done this since I was a kid. It does take a little bit of time to do this, but for a project this small, it's really not that bad. It only took me maybe like a half an hour to peel the bark off of these. To do this, I just peeled away the outer bark. Then I used my box cutter to scrape off this green layer, which according to my tree search is called the cambium. So you learn stuff here on this channel. I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do with this stuff, but I decided to keep it. At that point, I threw the sticks in my oven. Since these had already been air drying for about 2 weeks, I only had to leave them in the oven for about an hour. You want to use the lowest possible temperature if you're doing this. Otherwise, you risk charring the wood or starting a fire. I cut the base out of a scrap piece of hardboard. I split this into 2 bases because I'm going to be doing 2 different versions of this, a standard version and a snow-covered version. I cleaned up the base edges with my shears and beveled them with a razor blade. For each of these woodsheds, I cut 4 posts out using the 1/4-inch sticks and then some longer beams to sit on the top. By the way, I'm using pruners to cut these. I made one set of posts slightly shorter so the roof would have a bit of a pitch. I used my Dremel to grind out some rounded notches for the upper beam to sit in, and foolishly tried to glue it all together with wood glue, which sometimes just takes too long to cure. I ended up using super glue to glue the posts down, and then wood glue for the top beam. Once that was dry, I decided to lay down some sand. I drizzled some wood glue onto the bases, then used a wet brush to spread that out, and covered that with sand. Next, I cut out some rustic rafters to form the bottom part of the roof. For that part, I used the smaller sticks. After that, I added some diagonal support pieces to each post. Then I glued some stir sticks down on the roof. I did have to clamp them down in some spots due to the wavy nature of the sticks. I had to re-glue these a few times. There were a lot of spots that just didn't want to stick to the sticks. Once I finally got them mostly glued down, I went in with some pliers and just ripped a little bit off the ends, sticking with that rustic look. I wanted these wood sheds to be mostly open and visible from each side, so I didn't really want to build the walls up too much, but I did build a waist-high fence on one side, again using the smaller sticks and stir sticks. I also built this really crude looking box thing, and this equally as crude looking table. So I wanted the structure to have a different look than the actual firewood, even though they're both made of wood. I felt like that made sense. So before going any further, I decided to stain the frame. I wanted this to kind of match the fantasy houses that I've been building, so I used a similar recipe here that I used for the timbers for those. I started with a heavily thinned down brown, then I went in with a more vibrant burnt umber. I was also going in with a black-brown wash in certain spots. I like to build up the color in layers. When staining wood, I think that's the safer way to go, because it is really easy to go overboard with this. Once I was happy with that and everything was dry, I dry brushed the whole thing with some beige paint. I like the results that I get with this process. I think it gives the wood a really nice weathered look. At this point I added the firewood. I still have a lot of this stuff left over from my last project. If you want to see how I made these, check out my firewood stacks video. I have a mixture of whole logs, split logs, and then smaller sticks, and these are all roughly a ½ inch long. I decided to make the stacks a little bit more organized for the normal shed. For the snowy version, I just built up a stack of split logs, like they had just been thrown in there on a pile. I built the wood stacks up in layers on both versions, starting with wood glue for the first layer. I used that to block out where I wanted my firewood piles to be. Once that first layer was dry, I moved on to the next layer, building the piles up a little bit higher until they were about as high as I wanted them to be, which for the most part was about waist height for a mini. I also added some logs around the edges, kind of building out a little diorama. For the winter version, I thought it would be cool if there were a few holes in the roof, so I broke the stir sticks in one spot, and of course they completely broke off while I was doing that, so I had to re-glue them again. I positioned that hole right over top of the wood pile so I could sprinkle the snow down through it. Before that first layer dried, I sprinkled some shavings and sawdust around the logs. If you cut up logs for this, make sure you save any of the shavings, because they really add to the effect here. I kept adding logs to these until I felt like there was enough. Next, I'm going to show you how I did the roof for each of these. For the snowy version, I did some shingles, just cutting up some strips of thin cardboard and notching out some shingles, splitting the odds and evens apart, and trimming down every other one with the scissors. I added a lot of wood glue to that wash I was using earlier, mixed it up, and then just soaked the shingles in that. Added some wood glue to the roof to make sure everything sticks, and started layering them on top of the roof. In total, I put 2 holes in this roof. I made sure the one over the wood pile was nice and wide, and then I also kind of bent the shingles down around the edges. I'm never quite sure how to finish off the top of the shingles, especially with something like this. I cut up some single pieces and just layered them on top there. I didn't really love how that looked, but I knew it was going to be covered up with snow anyway, so I wasn't really too worried about it. For the other roof, I used plush fabric. I used this for my fantasy cottage build, and I'm not crazy about how it looks. It's something that I'm still working on trying to figure out, but it is really easy and quick to do. Once again, I was using the same mixture that I stained the previous roof with. There's plenty of wood glue in here, but I know the fabric is going to really soak up the color, so it needs to be a heavily pigmented mixture, which just means I need to add more paint. After trimming the fabric down, I had some scrap pieces, and you can use those scrap pieces to mix this up, and that will show you what it's going to look like and let you know if you need to add more paint. I was going for a pretty dark brown. Once that color was to my liking, I soaked the entire roof fabric in that, and then laid it over top of the frame. At this point, I kind of combed the fabric to make sure that everything was facing the right direction. I think this fabric kind of gives the impression of a clumpy thatched roof, so that's what we're going for here. Once that dries, it's going to look a little something like this. And then at that point, I dry brushed it. I started with a lighter brown. Mixed a little bit of yellow with that. Dry brushed it again. I gave it about 20 minutes to dry, then I mixed some white and yellow together, did a layer of that, and then finished it off with a very light yellowish tan color. Here's how the shingles look. After a day of drying, they're pretty solid, and I really like how grungy they look. I gave the logs a light wash, just to add some contrast to the texture of the logs, and I think it does give them a little bit more of an aged look. For the snowy shed, I went a lot darker with this, to boost the contrast between the snow and the logs. For the snow, I'm going to be using gesso and woodland scenic snow. I've used gesso before with great success. I would suggest if you're going to get gesso for this, make sure you get the heavier, thicker gesso. The gesso that I used for this was a thinner gesso, and it didn't quite give me the effect that I was going for, but I managed to make it work. You can always just keep layering it as well. But if you want to see a good example of how to use thicker gesso, check out my video on hiding layer lines. For that one, I did use thicker gesso, and I'm really happy with how that came out. I am happy with how this one came out too. It just wasn't quite what I was going for initially. I made sure not to cover this too much. I wanted it to be pretty clear what it was, and I definitely didn't want to hide those logs. Oh geez, what a mess. Let me clean this up real quick. While that was still wet, I sprinkled some woodland scenic snow on top of it. I gave that a day to dry, shook all the snow off, and sprayed it with a matte varnish, just to seal any of the loose snow. And finally I added some green flock around the edges, along with a few tufts. And here's what the final products look like. I think this is a nice project if you want some accessory structures for like a small village or like a camp. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Maybe leave a comment down below. As always, thank you to our patrons for the support, past and present. If you want to help support this channel, Patreon membership is a great way to do that. That's it. I hope you have a good day, and I will see you later.